Hello, and this video is going to be a discussion on Derrida's of Grammatology. I wanted to look through this important postmodern text in full. So if we were going to start, we will start in a similar way, in how Derrida himself looks at the formation of writing or its invention in the Sumerian myth in Uruk, where I think it's 3000 BC, where there's a messenger, passing messages along in, I think there's like a state of war or something, and essentially the other kingdom has overloaded the messenger or overcodified it with too many messages, and he knows he's unsuccessful at actually transmitting the messages, and so he writes them down and presents it to the other kingdoms, and of course they can't read themselves, and as the myth goes, Uruk and ends up being the culture creators over the other territories because writing things down, the pharmacon, as it were, in Plato, ends up submitting everyone else to the culture of writing, of remembering. And so the conclusion of the myth is that you have this ethnocentric of logic that comes about from he who has writing. He who has writing is cultured. Those who do not are savages, as we see in the polarity structures that we'll get into. So for Derrida, this means that the term logocentrism, as he uses quite often, makes science or makes the sciences possible to begin with in that referential way of going all the way back towards something like or the concept of being, or the logos, the ultimate being idea, which is traced back, of course, through the pre-Socratics with the likes of Heraclitus, but I think he focuses in on Plato, of course, and this metaphysics extends to Husserl and Heidegger, even though Heidegger would disagree with that. And so ultimately the logos is everything that is true is controlled or forced by the hand of the ultimate being itself. And so written words or uttered to the reference of signifiers in logocentric grounds is the transcendental being idea or God. And so rationality then out of that makes possible for what is considered truth in the Western tradition, at least according to Derrida. And so the second form of writing that features what he terms difference emerges, that is divorced out of the transcendental signifiers of God. He distincts between good writing and bad writing. Good writing, if we were to ask someone like Joseph de Maistre, for example, the Magna Carta was written on the soul of the Anglo. It wasn't just something that was invented or just a concept that came about in abstraction or just some agreed upon rubric of what is considered truth. It's the messages and metaphors from the soul itself. And so in the Platonic example of writing, in the Pharmacon, which Derrida cites often, is the example of writing being the cure and the poison together. Just as Socrates never wrote anything down, Plato writes for him. And even though Plato critiques the written word as a fallen state, if you will, he ultimately still is writing down to tell us that it is in a state of fallenness and thus remembered, or the Socratic dialogues are remembered because of this. And so in Derrida's take, speech is privileged over and closer to being in the metaphysical tradition, or in logocentrism, where writing is second removed from being. Immediate access to the self or to the higher being is from the spoken word, which I have a video on the channel called The Fallenness of the Written Word, which uses this quite often. And so writing then is an exterior bounded to the senses in the dichotomy of the metaphysical Western centrist tradition. You have the sensory of intelligibility as opposed to metaphor. Meanings of words then shift and change, signifiers with the absent center. There is no fixed essence writing of freedom. And so, as we've talked about with the difference between, the two different types of writing, the intelligent writing or forms is exterior, or the supplement, or the absence of the center. And so, freedom, of course, which is, of course, a main theme for postmodernism, the ultimate freedom concept that you see with Sartre and the likes of that. We aren't bound by metaphysical presence or the privilege of ultimate being. And I think the idea of presence is really what you want to get at with what Derrida is trying to do on this text. Is he's trying to pick apart that metaphysical supposition of presence, being of the most important aspect. And so if we're going to go through his famous dichotomy of, not dichotomy, his famous terminology of deconstruction. So deconstruction, the sealing of writing as exterior or third removed from discussions on being inside the interior speech, is access to the logos. And so he's pulling apart the ancient metaphysics here and the boundaries of polarity of interior and exterior, of privileging presence and non-presence, being and non-being. And so he's privileging, or at least examining and critiquing how the Western tradition would privilege some of these polarities, or picking them apart. And so writing has the association with institutions such as past works with Rousseau, and thus suggests the state of a fallenness. And so the metaphysical opposition of speech and writing is, of course, false for Derrida, as writing, there's it isn't just this ambiguous thing that's, you have writing here and the spoken word here. Clearly, there's cross reference here. There is an interloping, because it's not just this ambiguous thing. Acoustic speech impression and the signs of the written word, the signifier and the signified, or representation of speech, in and of itself makes it a non-arbitrary act. And so when he looks at the history of writing and archy writing, or difference in the trace, the concept of spacing makes possible the play of significance in the first place. And so difference is the production of that semiotic form. So archy writing makes the play or metaphysical opposition or difference possible in an a priori sense of differentiation of a sign through play. And so what he really means by that, of course, is that his anti-metaphysics here is actually a priori. So, anything that we think of, any concepts that we make, which he doesn't think this is a concept, is only made possible through, play and difference. And so to explain tracing, the trace is reduced to the full presence of the logos or oppositions. It's the remainder of the absolutes of two sets that were in stone on fixed principles. And so trace makes logocentric knowledge possible in the first place, because there cannot be a knowledge or object in the logocentric tradition. So the logocentric of techniques, such as, for example, spell check. If you type in difference, as Derrida does, you'll get the little red squiggly lines underneath, because it'll try to change it to difference. And so that's what he's really, this is just a simple example really to explain how technology or techniques in the logocentric tradition, bounds us and presupposes these sorts of acts, such as, grand metaphysical ideas of being. He wants to pull that apart, of course, and let there be play and trace these different forms and free them out. The hinge webs together the grapheme of writing and the phonon of spokenness brought together in space and time, linked through the hinge. And so Derrida then sets his sight on the mental conscious structure in tradition, to let, once again, the traces have freedom for play and exploration by pulling back these metaphysics and suppositions that constantly refer back to. So traces or language are the hidden meanings within language itself. There's sort of an example of, if you just write down something like a double entendre, which is extremely popular to use in the form of hip hop, or at least the more highbrow stuff, if you will, the more poetic side of it, if you will. You constantly have these sayings or these words that have multiple meanings, and so Derrida is trying to free that up and show how language and these suppositions hide away tracing, hide away play. And so if you look at how Derrida's works from here kind of even buck the linear line, the tyranny of the linear line, and how there could be more than one meaning than simply the word at any given time. So Derrida warns that difference is the matrix of significance, and it isn't just trying to go back to past conscious structures or past myth making. And so when he sets his sails towards another polarity to come out of the natural savage and the cultured man, this is when he looks at how Strauss's look at civilization and barbarism. He makes the distinction between writing and culture and those who do not have writing. So writing, in Strauss's example of when he lived with more tribal societies, corrupted the natural peoples outside of civilization or primitive societies. When Strauss talks of proper names in the tribe he was trying to teach writing towards, Derrida says that by the examples that Strauss actually gives of people giving proper names, which of course insinuates that one can be cursed with a proper name, or is exposed or made naked through this, that this is, of course, an act of violence. So even before writing, as Strauss tried to make reference here, there are still acts of violence. And so this shows significance, or the signifiers, without writing, such as when the elder, who couldn't read or write, solidified his power by just making up what was written down on these scribbles that they were doing. And so writing becomes this power structure, or an act of sovereignty, from this tribal example. And so Derrida, of course, as I mentioned before, he points out that violence within his own example preceded writing. And so Derrida, on the writing supplement of adding onto something, the supplement of absence is the chain of difference, and the absent center towards new signs. So substitution, such as the example of the wet nurse compared to the mother birth, there's a substitution as opposed to the real thing. So difference is always this chain of going back towards a vacancy that was once there or once experienced. Such as the example of man is always trying to find a sort of return to his motherly love, where she loved you unconditionally. You didn't need status or anything like that. So the wife or whatever is a sort of supplement to that unconditional love, or the lover in general. Even though it's just a supplement and it's ultimately not the real thing, it's still a chain, though, that can't be, that has a sort of significance towards it. And so for Derrida, the chain of signifiers overtakes the vacancy itself. And so for Derrida, there's nothing outside the text, of course. Just as we talked about with logocentrism always having the ultimate being concept, or these metaphysical principles, these first principles. For Derrida, of course, there's nothing ontological grounding before texts. So texts layer out in ad infinitum. So there's no subject or author fold, such as with hermeneutics and the sort of subjective grids we talked about in the last video. There's foldings, or books within books. So everything is always a reference towards a past text. Just like my written word video is folded from this Grammatology text. You're always, to use Heideggerian language, you're always thrown into a sort of logocentric model within the world that, ad infinitum, goes back to past texts, to past experiences. And so the author embeds his text within other texts. Therefore, you don't really have a sort of author-subject dichotomy. The foldings of citations and interludes of different texts is a sort of self-sufficiency for Derrida through the text. So you have an endless chain of supplements or substitutions, such as the example of trying to recapture the mother's love. And if we're going to move on now to this deconstruction of Rousseau's Origin of Language, Rousseau sets his critique of the comparison of melody music theory as a representation of nature. So music and harmony, corrupts. Harmony is an exterior to the melody, has an unnecessary orientation towards music. Now, of course, Rousseau is like in the 17th century, so his music theory doesn't really hold up, but you can see that sort of polarity difference between the representation of nature as compared to harmony as the exterior. So for Derrida, harmony with nature is one of the constitutive instances of what makes melody a part of the system of opposition to begin with. So for Derrida, when he talks about languages, there's the myth polarity of catastrophe in the original barbarous state of nature towards civilization. Rousseau has a really interesting myth of the sort of northern Faustian empirical language and its articulation as compared to the passions of the South. There's love and there's intellect there. There's a sort of difference. And so Derrida wants to pick this apart, of course, with Rousseau's theory of language here, by saying sign production or articulation was always on the inside and essential for the difference for language to come into being to begin with. And so there's the logocentric tradition comes from the algebraic formalization of hieroglyphics and become more abstract, and the traces of the nonlinear tradition vanishes. So representation of the thing, Derrida says, this kills the thing and freezes and arrests time, destroying the thing thus regarded as a supplement. And so Derrida sees that the archaic writing in speech to begin with, thus it isn't a fall of articulation and was a part of the sign production to begin with. So for Derrida, in a rather interesting way, I want to sort of part and end here. He, says that, of course, this isn't a concept, because in order for concepts to be, you have to have the difference, or the spacing between space and time, to be able to, have a sort of logocentric model to begin with. So in a way, he actually, doing a type of metaphysic. It's just an anti-metaphysic. And so the spacing principle between signs and the supplement, therefore, is always at the source or origin in the conditions within the system to let that polarity be to begin with, is a rough summation of what he's trying to get at with of grammatology. Everything that is apparently a polarity or a difference, in these metaphysical structures, could always be found within that origin to begin with. Whether it was writing and speech, whether it was presence and non-presence, and many different examples that he goes on throughout this text. And so I wanted to end here, really. I think it was a pretty thorough video in the end, trying to cut back on upload times with 40-minute videos for you guys, and be a bit more thorough in my delivery as well. So I hope you guys enjoy him, offering a sort of anti-metaphysic, though, in a way. And I suppose if we were going to end on perhaps a bit of a critique when he talks about the corruptibility of humanity, really, in the sort of example of when he looked at how Strauss looked at tribal societies. Sorry about the background noise, by the way. There's a sort of a relativization, if you will, of technology, because he's trying to say that human beings sort of in their origins have the act of violence, have in their origins they have all of the necessary conditions to make these differences to begin with. I think this in a way kind of misses the point of what the critiques of writing actually were, insofar that every time you introduce something new, something different, whether it was the village elder solidifying his power, this clearly enhanced his sovereignty over the tribe through the act of him pretending like he knew you know writing as opposed to everyone else, just as it was with the Sumerians prior. You don't need to relativize the idea that technics or technology pick apart prior ways of being in the world. And so I think in that regard, of grammatology, sort of downplays this, that there clearly is a process going on when new technology is introduced. That is a sort of pharmacon, as Plato would describe. Yes, there are solutions to prior problems with this new form of technology, this new convenience, if you will, brought about, this new way of being able to remember things. But just as in the pharmacon, people will attribute unfounded knowledge to themselves because they're simply able to read something written down. That doesn't actually mean that you necessarily have true knowledge in the prior forms of really understanding in such a way that I always talk about the Hindus, of course, with how they never really wrote anything down. It's actually mesmerizing to consider that they were able to recite metaphysics in the spoken word. That just shows how astute they were with their memory, and that's something that you don't really see in the West very often, if ever, especially now with the way technology, and even today most people walking down the street now would agree that technology has made us forget a lot of things. Certainly with the rise of ADHD treatments and diagnosis, there's certainly an element to perhaps our mental faculties not being as sharp as they were prior. There's a really interesting post that I saw once that was showing a math test from 100 years ago in America, and there's no way that anyone, unless you were in a prestigious school, would even be able to pass this fifth grade math test, if we're being honest. And yet this that was just something that people were able to recite and do all the time. So there, to conclude, there definitely is an erosion of the way we as beings are in the world when new technology is introduced, and how it will close and reveal things that I think grammatology and Derrida in general sort of downplays. But yeah, this is my Of Grammatology lecture, and I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe before we look at some of the empirical thinkers to come in this time period as well.